Hey everyone. So to start with, we're going to discuss the beginning section of the novel. But before we get to that, make sure that you have watched the videos in the Context and Content book on Moodle, as it helps to provide some historical background on Mary Shelley herself, as well as some philosophical context into a lot of the themes that we'll be seeing throughout the book, particularly the ideas on personhood and what it means to be human. So if you haven't already, check those out. Also make sure that you've got your note-taking implements at hand, as especially if you're using the digital ebook, it'll become very easy to lose or forget key moments or ideas from the text, so it'll help immensely to have them written down. Going along with that, make sure that you have looked at the Frankenstein research project, also up on Moodle. Obviously there's not much you can do with it right now without having at least started the book, but it'll help you to at least have it in the back of your head, and it might help you to focus your notes. Okay, without further ado, here we go. For consistency and simplicity's sake, I'll be using the ebook provided on Moodle for page numbers, but if you're reading your own copy, then it should still be pretty easy to find the correct spots anyway. The first 14 pages act as a foreword to that particular edition, and while it is interesting background, it's not necessarily mandatory reading. The important stuff begins on the title page, with the subtitle of The Modern Prometheus. I've added a very brief retelling of the Prometheus myth into the context book on Moodle, so you can check that out if you like. It'll become thematically important later on, particularly in regards to Shelley's discussions on the potential dangers of knowledge and the quote-unquote wrong kinds of education. The next important part of the title page comes from the epigraph, a quote from the epic poem Paradise Lost, written by John Milton. The poem relates the biblical story of creation, although it flips the narrative by primarily having it told from Satan and Adam's point of view, the actual quote coming from the latter. This will be important later on, but even now you can begin to make inferences as to how it may apply to the creature and his creator, Victor Frankenstein. While I obviously will not be asking you to read the poem, because it'd take you longer than the actual novel itself, I have posted a very brief summary of it in the context book as well, should you be further interested in it. Now, the book begins with an introduction from Mary Shelley herself, which you should read, as it elaborates in her own words on her motivations for writing the story. As a general rule, you should try to read author introductions for that exact reason. With that being said, the preface from her husband, Percy, can probably be skipped over. Anyway, we begin the story in an unlikely spot, as a series of letters from a man named Robert Walton addressed to his sister, Mrs. Margaret Saville, in the year 17-something. This creates the framing device for the novel, which we have talked about before. In short, a framing device creates the effect of a story within a story, which writers will often use to further emphasize their themes. In this case, for this particular novel, we'll eventually see a story within a story within a story, and I'll give you a hint. Its purpose can be summed up in Shrek's famous onion analogy.
Layers! Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers? You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody likes onions.
Cake! Everybody loves cakes.
In any case, we see that Walton is attempting an expedition to the North Pole, seemingly for the purpose of charting a northern passage and perhaps discovering certain magnetic principles, but his true motivations are where Shelley begins to lay the foundations for her themes. As Walton says on page 23, his goal is to satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited. These are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death. You cannot contest the inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation. Essentially, Walton's true goal is fame and recognition for his discovery, the desire to leave his mark on history.
I'm Mariah Malibu, I'm Hollywood's new princess. I'm in Beverly Hills, and I'm going to be the most famous person in the world.
This is further exemplified on the next page, where he references his failed attempts at poetry, and how he desired to be remembered in the same breath as Shakespeare and Homer, and when he further states, my life might have been passed in ease and luxury, but I preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. Right away, we begin to see Walton's hubris, his ambition and quest for recognition and glory. And as we know from years of study, this sort of drive can quite often lead to disaster. Shelley knows this, and lays the thematic groundwork early. The second letter introduces us to Walton's internal struggle, namely that he is lonely. He describes how his unorthodox homeschooled upbringing based off his Uncle Thomas's books have led him to feel isolated and unable to make these vital human connections. Shelley creates this facet of Walton for several reasons. One, it reflects her own unique upbringing and education, lending an autobiographical slant to the work, and two, and more importantly for our purposes, it introduces the themes of human connection and companionship, and the importance that they play in the creation of a healthy individual. Now, even if you've never read the book, you are likely familiar with some interpretation of the Frankenstein story, so you know how the creature is shunned by society, which leads to his more monster-ish qualities. Heck, you see it in stories that have nothing to do with Frankenstein. The loneliness that Walton feels will become a thematic motif throughout the novel, connecting him to the other primary characters.
I'm half machine. I'm a monster!
The other idea Shelley presents through this has to do with the importance of the quote-unquote right kind of education, and the influence that has on a person. Walton feels that his self-taught homeschooling has left him defective in some ways, and Shelley furthers this idea through a juxtaposition of Walton's two shipmates, the lieutenant and the master. These two characters have no importance later on to the story, but they do act, as I said, as symbolic representations of Shelley's themes, displayed through Walton's anecdotes. The lieutenant is a stereotypical Englishman, and is, quote, madly desirous of glory, or rather to word my phrase more characteristically, advancement in his profession, unquote. However, his isolation from society has given him, in Walton's eyes, a higher sense of nobility. The story of the master and his lover furthers this idea, and puts it into words when, as Walton explains, he determines that the master is so noble only because he is, quote, wholly uneducated, unquote. Through these characters, Shelley suggests that education, or at the very least the quote-unquote wrong kind of education, is in fact detrimental to humanity and moves us further away from our innate nobility. This is of course debatable, but it will lead to some interesting questions later on. The letter ends with an allusion to another famous poem, which is also on Moodle, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's the story of a sailor who kills an albatross for no good reason, and is then cursed by nature to suffer and atone for all time. Aside from being an influence on the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, it has a couple other layers to it as well. Coleridge was actually a friend of Mary Shelley's father, and legend says that she heard him read the poem as a young girl, which left a profound effect on her. In terms of critical value, however, it introduces yet another theme of Shelley's, the danger of going against nature and the consequences thereof. You can probably guess who's guilty of that. Letter 3 is just kind of there, but letter 4 is where the big stuff happens, namely our first glimpse of the creature, at a distance anyway, and Walton's meeting of Victor Frankenstein, who he pulls up onto his ship in a near-death state. And the great thing is, for Walton at least, is that in Victor, he's found a friend. Yay!
What? Did we just become best friends? Yup!
He finds in Victor a kindred spirit, and as he states on page 32, I have found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as the brother of my heart. Now, again, we already know who Victor is and what he's done, but now we see how Shelley is going to structure her story. This is a Victor Frankenstein who has already created his creature, and seemingly suffered a great deal for it. This tells us that going forward we'll be hearing Victor's story through flashback as he relates his sad tale to Walton, which also creates a new layer of symbolism. Walton is now meant to act as a reader's surrogate, meaning that he is supposed to be a reflection of us, or our gateway into the story. Even Victor himself sets the stage for this being a cautionary tale when he declares, Unhappy man, do you share my madness? Have you drunk also of the intoxicating draught? Hear me, let me reveal my tale, and you will dash the cup from your lips. Victor clearly sees that Walton is on the same lonely, obsessive path that he was, and agrees with Walton when he says that a life without friendship is an incomplete one. He also fears that Walton will suffer as Victor has, foreshadowed by Victor hinting at the best friend that he has lost, as well as the grim events that led him to chasing a monster across the ice of the Arctic. As a way to deter Walton from his path, he will tell him his own story, much like the Ancient Mariner from the previously alluded to poem. And so we switch from Walton as a narrator to Victor, and begin our story proper. My next video will be a quick discussion of chapters 1 through 6, so stay tuned and I will see you next time.